Among the world's towering giants, none carry a darker legend than the formidable K2. Soaring to a staggering 8,611 meters, it stands as the world's second highest peak, just behind Everest in height, but leagues ahead in danger. K2's fearsome reputation isn't just myth, it's earned every ounce of its notoriety within the mountaineering world. Nicknamed the Savage Mountain, it's a name that whispers of unforgiving terrain, merciless conditions, and a long list of lives claimed in the attempt to tame it. Since it was first summited in 1954, K2 has consistently remained one of the deadliest mountains on Earth. From the first ascent in 1954 until the end of 1994, 113 climbers summited K2, and 38 never returned. Even those with only a passing interest in high-altitude climbing have likely heard of K2's brutal difficulty and rare prestige. But what makes K2 such a punishing climb? It's the lethal cocktail of obstacles: bone-chilling Himalayan cold, wildly unpredictable weather systems, oxygen-starved altitudes, and perilous technical climbing sections that test even the most seasoned climbers. It's no wonder that reaching its summit is regarded as the ultimate badge of honor, a crown jewel in the world of mountaineering. Because of its savage reputation and unforgiving remoteness, straddling the rugged border of Pakistan and China, only the most elite, battle-hardened mountaineers dare to challenge its wrath, and many never return. Among those many tragedies, the catastrophe of 2008 stands out. A haunting day when 11 climbers perished in a single descent. But make no mistake, that was only one chapter in this mountain's long, blood-stained history. The summer of 1995 on K2 was shaping up to be anything but ordinary. By late July, several expedition teams had gathered near its icy base, anxiously eyeing the summit and preparing for their shot at glory. As is often the case on K2, the season had been relentlessly marred by brutal storms and stretches of punishing weather. Climbers used the chaotic downtime to acclimatize, train, and wait, hoping that a rare and precious break in the clouds might open the gates to the summit. Among those poised to make history was a determined British mountaineer named Alison Hargreaves. Already a legend in her own right, Alison had just achieved a breathtaking solo ascent of Everest's North Ridge without supplemental oxygen only a month earlier. Her next challenge was the Savage Mountain. For this attempt, Alison joined forces with an American team led by Rob Slater. Their target was the standard but treacherous Abruzzi Spur. By August 6th, the group had climbed to the perilous height of Camp 4-7, 850 meters above sea level, and even ventured slightly higher into the dreaded zone above 8,000 meters, where the air grows dangerously thin and every movement becomes a battle. But just as summit dreams were beginning to crystallize, a foreboding forecast shattered their plans. Storms were imminent. With survival in mind, the team made the difficult but wise decision to retreat to base camp. Disheartened but alive, most members abandoned their K2 ambitions for the year. Yet Alison and Rob weren't ready to quit, not after coming so heartbreakingly close. A new window of clear weather loomed on the horizon after nearly 6 weeks of non-stop storms. The mountain was finally showing mercy. Rested and resolved, the duo made a bold decision. They would try again. On August 9th, they set out once more, quietly leaving behind only a few other climbers at base camp who were also clinging to hopes of a late-season summit. By August 11th, they had made solid progress and reached the site of Camp 3 at 7,250 meters. But what they found there stopped them cold. Camp 3 had been obliterated, buried beneath an avalanche that had struck while they were away. Desperate and exhausted, they scoured the snow for any trace of their gear, but it was gone. With little choice, they pressed on, pushing themselves to the limit with a grueling climb to reach Camp 4 by nightfall. Morning broke on August 12th with rare and beautiful clarity. The skies were open, the winds calm, a perfect forecast for summiting. But their bodies needed recovery after the brutal ascent. Wisely, they chose to rest, conserving their strength for the decisive climb the following morning. That evening, while scouting the route ahead, Alison and Rob encountered a Spanish team that had also left base camp on August 9th, though they had taken the south-southeast spur rather than the Abruzzi. The Spanish climbers, Javier Olivar, Javier Escartin, Lorenzo Ortiz, Lorenzo Ortas, and Jose Garces, joined forces with Rob and Alison, agreeing to coordinate their summit bids. Their plan was set. Both teams would meet the next day at the infamous bottleneck, a narrow, ice-laden choke point that has sealed the fate of many. At 2 a.m. on August 13th, Rob and Alison began their final ascent. The path ahead was steep, dangerous, and physically punishing. But they were not alone. Other climbers from Camp 4 were also chasing the summit that very day. Among those making the final push alongside Alison and Rob was a climber with a legacy as towering as the mountain itself, Peter Hillary, son of the legendary Sir Edmund Hillary. Peter was part of a four-man Canadian-New Zealander joint expedition that included Bruce Grant, Jeff Lakes, and Kim Logan. Like Alison and Rob, they too had resolved to seize what looked like the last viable window to summit the Savage Mountain. The combined team made steady progress through the early morning hours of August 13th. By mid-morning, they had climbed past the shoulder and arrived at one of the mountain's most feared features, the bottleneck. This deadly stretch is a steep, narrow chute flanked by the looming menace of a massive sérac, a hanging glacier capable of collapsing without warning. Per their earlier plan, the climbers from the Abruzzi Spur and the Spanish team converged at the bottleneck. The Spanish group, having started earlier at midnight, were already making headway up the slope by the time the English-speaking climbers arrived. But not everyone was convinced it was worth the risk. Peter Hillary, ever cautious and well-attuned to mountain signs, noticed ominous altostratus clouds rolling in fast. The wind had picked up, kicking snow off the ridge in ghostly plumes. Something didn't feel right. Hillary made the call to turn back, along with 5 others. They began retreating first to the Spanish Camp 4, then ultimately back to the Abruzzi camp, leaving the others to continue toward the summit. Later, Hillary would vividly describe the moment he made his decision. Big altostratus clouds were moving in, and a strong wind was blowing snow. I saw everyone crossing the traverse, then they disappeared into the clouds. Not long after Hillary turned back, fellow teammate Jeff Lakes also had a change of heart. He retreated from the climb and returned to Camp 4, joining the group that had abandoned the summit bid. Meanwhile, the remaining climbers, including Alison, Rob, and members of the Spanish expedition, pressed onward. Throughout the afternoon, they inched closer to the top, battling fatigue and altitude. Then, at around 6:45 p.m., Alison Hargreaves made radio contact with the Spanish Camp 4. Her voice crackled through the static with stunning news. She had reached the summit of K2. Beside her was Javier Olivar, one of the Spanish climbers. Against all odds, they had made it. Strangely, the bad weather that had spooked Hillary seemed to vanish. From Camp 4, Lorenzo Ortas, a Spanish climber who had turned back earlier, described the conditions as exceptional. They could have descended easily in the light of the full moon, he said, but that window of clarity wouldn't last. As night began to fall, the mountain transformed. Ferocious winds began whipping up K2's north face with terrifying intensity, blowing at speeds of 100 to 140 miles per hour. The first to feel the brunt of it was Jeff Lakes, who had been descending from Spanish Camp 4 after resting. As he neared the Black Pyramid, a technically treacherous section of the mountain, he was suddenly ambushed by the screaming wind, making every step a brutal fight to stay upright. But that was only the beginning. The real storm was still climbing, and it was heading straight for the summit. Between 8 and 9 p.m., the winds that had begun as whispers of doom became full-blown screams. At Spanish Camp 4, the storm's fury struck with a vengeance. One of the Spanish climbers who had turned back earlier that day, Jose Garces, realized with growing dread that his tent was no longer anchored. It was lifting. His shelter, his lifeline at nearly 8,000 meters, was being ripped from the mountain. Fortunately, fellow climber Lorenzo Ortas saw what was happening and lunged to hold the tent just long enough for Jose to scramble out. The two men crammed into Lorenzo's tent as the wind howled with unrelenting violence. But even this refuge was failing. To avoid being blown off the mountain, they made a desperate decision, slashing a hole in the fabric to allow the wind to pass through. It was their only hope of keeping the tent grounded. Jose hadn't been able to grab his gear. No sleeping bag, no clothes, no food. The two men had one bag between them. They huddled close inside what remained of Lorenzo's shredded tent, battling the cold and altitude through a night that would feel eternal. But even this fragile shelter wouldn't last. By 11 p.m., their tent was in tatters, nearly torn apart by the wind and now starting to lift. Their only option was to retreat into the ragged, flapping remnants of their tents, pressing into the snow and each other with their single sleeping bag for warmth. It was hell, but it wasn't the worst place to be that night, because higher on the mountain, far above the last camp, were Alison Hargreaves, her teammates, and the rest of the Spanish summit party, still trapped within the death zone, exposed, vulnerable, alone. And what exactly happened to them during that long, brutal night would remain a mystery, because none of them would survive it. When the morning light of August 14th broke over K2, the storm had calmed, its rage spent. At around 8 a.m., frostbitten and barely functioning, Lorenzo Ortas and Jose Garces emerged from the wreckage of their camp. They knew no one left above could still be alive. With heavy hearts, they began their descent down the south-southeast spur. By 4 p.m., they had reached about 7,400 meters when something caught their eye. Items of clothing scattered off to the side of their line. Lorenzo went to investigate. What he found stopped him cold. It was a boot with a hearing device inside. He recognized it instantly. Alison had shown it to him just days before, tucked inside her gear with a battery pack kept warm beneath her clothes. Just 3 meters below the boot, Lorenzo found a dark purple coat with a delicate floral pattern. Alison's. Inside it was her harness, still attached to a pyramid ascender. Both were soaked in blood. Lorenzo looked up the gully. He saw 3 long slide marks leading down the slope from the summit ridge, estimated around 8,500 meters near the traverse that leads to the bottleneck. She must have fallen. Hard. He took the bloodied harness with him, knowing he would return it to her family. A short while later, further down the left edge of the gully, Lorenzo saw a body, still solitary, resting on a flat patch surrounded by seracs. The figure wore red, and he remembered Alison's red inner clothing beneath the floral coat. He was now certain he had found Alison Hargreaves. He kept searching for any signs of his Spanish teammates, Javier Olivar and the others who had summited with Alison, but there was no trace. After speaking quietly with Jose about what he'd found, the two decided to skip the minimal supplies at Camp 3 and push all the way to Camp 2. By 10 p.m., they had made it. The next morning, August 15th, at 8 a.m., they made radio contact with members of the expedition team still on the Abruzzi Spur. They exchanged information, trying to piece together the final hours of those lost above. But the storm had one final revelation left to deliver, because it wasn't done claiming lives just yet. Jeff Lakes had been the first to be struck by the storm. On August 12th, as he approached a treacherous technical section just below the Black Pyramid, the wind slammed into him with full force. He somehow managed to descend the deadly climbing stretch, but by then, he was also suffering from altitude sickness. Alone, battered, and barely conscious, Jeff made the decision to push even further down, to Camp 2 at 6,600 meters. What followed was a nightmarish 30-hour descent through relentless winds and punishing cold. No partner, no rope team, just survival. On August 14th, Jeff finally stumbled into Camp 2, barely able to walk, his body broken by exposure and altitude. He was quickly ushered into a tent by one of his teammates from the Canadian-New Zealander expedition, but it was too late. Despite the miracle of his descent, Jeff's body had taken too much. In the early morning hours of August 15th, Jeff Lakes died from his injuries. He had survived the storm, but not the aftermath. In the wake of the tragedy, countless questions would haunt the climbing world. What exactly happened to the others during that fateful night? Could it have been avoided? Some, like Peter Hillary, who had turned back before the storm, felt their decisions vindicated. 10 minutes later, I had made up my mind, Hillary would later reflect. I tried to logically assess the situation, but in my altitude-debilitated condition, nothing seemed clear-cut. With the others continuing above, I wondered, did they know something I didn't? Going up meant a shot at the summit, going down meant failure, but a little voice whispered, softly, clearly. Sometimes it whispers and is too often ignored, but that day it said, go down now. For the survivors of the Spanish team, the soul-searching cut deeper. Had their friends fallen victim to summit fever, that dangerous, blinding obsession with reaching the top? Or were they simply at the mercy of an uncontrollable force? One of those rare, brutal, snowless windstorms that clears K2's summit of its veil of clouds, misleading climbers with a sudden illusion of ideal weather. Pakistani officials were less forgiving. Fawad Khan, a liaison between the military and the rescue efforts, claimed he had warned Alison Hargreaves directly before she and Rob Slater left base camp on August 9th. Another summit attempt this season would be suicidal, he had said, but the mountain does not care about warnings. It does not care about intuition or obsession. That storm, fierce, sudden, and merciless, claimed 7 lives in August of 1995. And it added yet another chapter to the brutal legacy of the savage mountain. K2 had taken again,